I know I've been focusing on streamer flies lately, but I wanted to throw one in this fall that is kind of a streamer. It's actually a nymph representation. This is the Murray's Hellgrammite. It swims very much like a streamer. It bounces along the bottom. You fish this more like a streamer than you do, say, a nymph. But it's just a fantastic pattern this time of year. It is tied very similar to a woolly bugger. You've got some tail material, a chenille body, and a polymer hackle. There's different versions of this and variations of it, but this is the Murray's Hellgrammite. The one key to this is the Ostrich Herl in the tail. And then the pinchers on front, which some people put in and some people don't. But it's a productive pattern, even in the summertime, but in the fall it seems to, at least for me, produce a little bit better. Anyway, that's the Murray's Hellgrammite, and we'll go ahead and get started tying. Start the Murray's Hellgrammite by placing our hook on the vise. This is a Mustad R74, and this is a size 6 hook. It's a 4X long streamer hook. I'll go ahead and debarb the hook. And then I'm going to attach my thread. For thread, I'm just using a Uni 8/0 in a black. If you're going to tie this in an olive or a brown or something like that, then just change the thread color to match the overall body of the fly. I'm going to attach my thread right behind the eye of the hook, and I'm going to run it down about an eye length down the shank of the hook, and then bring it back up to the eye. The first material that I'm going to tie in is going to be the little antennas that stick out the front. And I find it's just easier to tie these in now than to try and get them in later. I'm using some round rubber legs. These are medium in a black. These are maybe about 1.5 inches. They're already pre-cut, so I can just strip one off. At the halfway point here, I'm going to lash this down onto the hook shank. I want it to go to the outside of the hook shank, or at least in this upper outside corner. I'm going to go ahead and wrap down that same eye length down the hook shank and bring my thread back up. Then I'm going to fold this leg over to the other side. This is where it can get a little bit tricky, because what we want to do is we want to have the antenna splay out up front. But be careful, because this second one here tends to want to push straight over the eye of the hook and not be, at about a 35-40 degree angle. Now, don't worry if these are a little bit too far apart like this, because when we finish the fly, it's actually going to pull them together a little bit. Once your antennae are lashed in, bring your thread to just behind the back end of the rubber legs along the hook shank. That's where we're going to tie in our weight. For weight, I'm using an extra small dumbbell eyes. These are just unpainted lead dumbbell eyes. I'm going to tie this in right behind the rubber legs. You could just use wraps of lead if you want along the hook shank. The original Hellgrammite was tied that way, not with the dumbbell eyes. The dumbbell eyes will give it a little bit more of a jigging motion, but at the same time, if you don't want that, if you want something a little more subtle, then by all means omit those and just put some lead wraps along the hook shank. I'm going to anchor those down with some crisscross wraps, and then some wraps underneath the dumbbell eyes and above the hook shank to bind that in. I'm going to bring my thread down to the end of the shank. This does not have to be pretty, so I do not need touching turns along the hook shank. You're just moving from one end to the other. The next material I'm going to tie in is the tail. Now you remember I said that the Hellgrammite is kind of like a woolly bugger, and it's how it's tied in. The original, or the first version of the Hellgrammite, was tied with Marabou until it was suggested to use the Ostrich Herl, and it worked much better for the action they were wanting to get from the fly. So our tail material is actually going to be Ostrich Herl. You're going to cut, you can go 15 to 20 strands if you want, or herls. I generally will grab about an inch of enough herl to cover about an inch of the stem of the feather, and that's what I'll cut off and tie in. With those cut from the stem of the feather, I just even these up on this end a little bit. It just helps when I tie this down. I want these to come right up behind the dumbbell eyes. This is just to add a little bit more bulk to the fly. That's all that does. It's just a little underbody, adds a little bit more bulk to it. I'm going to lash those down all the way down the end of the hook shank real well. Now, if you want, you could tie these in with the tapered ends here, right here, having all of these off the back side. I find it's just as easy to tie that in along the hook shank where the butt ends are, and then I'm going to cut this to about twice the hook shank length. These having an abrupt end to them, I don't think really hurts the fly. And then if you want, now I have enough to make another fly. So that's our tail tied in. For the hackle, I'm using, this is a saddle hackle, Rooster saddle hackle in black. These are off of a whiting bugger pack. But if you don't have that, if all you've got is just some strung saddle or something like that, that's fine. I'm going to take a long feather, just like your woolly bugger. You want the fibers shorter at the back end here and longer up near the front. So I'm going to tie this in by the tip. I'm going to stroke these fibers down out of the way, and I'm going to tie this in by the tip. The body of our Murray's Hellgrammite is a medium Rayon chenille. If you want, you could use a large. It's going to make it look a little bit thicker. You could even dub the body if you want to, if you didn't have any chenille. I'm going to tie the end of the chenille in along the hook shank, right at the back end of the shank. Once that's all tied in, bring my thread up to just between the back of the eye of the hook and the dumbbell eyes to tie in these materials. I'm going to put some head cement along the body here as well as around the eyes. Let that soak down in there. It's just going to make it a little bit more secure, and it'll help bind this in a little bit. Now your Rayon chenille, sometimes when it comes off the card, tends to be kind of flat. So what I like to do is go ahead and twist this. So I'm just going to twist this with my fingers, and it just twists that up a little bit. I can run my scissors along it, and it just makes it a little fuller. And then I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in. So now palmer in your chenille, and then we'll palmer in the hackle. Hammer the hackle in, you want to only put about 4 wraps in this area here, and then maybe an extra behind. You don't really want to fill this up. This is to suggest legs on our Hellgrammite, that's all. And then I'll put 2 to 3 wraps right around the front here just to do the same thing, kind of fill that in. Grab the pinchers, moisten your fingers, and then stroke all these fibers in a rearward direction so that we can get those lashed down. If you have some like these right here that are pointing forward, generally I would not be concerned with them. Again, this is a fly that's just, it's going to bounce along the bottom and it's going to look messy, and that's fine. So you can cut some of these out if you want, just for the sake of that looking better. But we're going to lash that in, and you'll probably notice that as I get a few wraps right behind the eye of the hook to make the head of this fly, my pinchers just kind of got drawn together, and that's fine. I'll do a 4 or 5 turn whip finish. Try not to wrap down along the eye of the hook. You don't want to crowd it, because then you're really going to be bringing those pinchers together, and you still want them to be a little bit apart, keeping in mind that they're going to bounce around and kind of take on a life of their own. You can push your thumbnail back on those a little bit if you want to try and splay those out. As long as they're a little bit apart like this, that's all you really need. Some of these, actually, you'll see some people tie them and they don't even include the pinchers to them. I'll trim those so that there's about a half a shank length or so sticking out the front. And that's just to give them a little added bit of life. Some head cement along the thread wraps. And that is a Murray's Hellgrammite. As I mentioned, it's very similar to a woolly bugger. If you can tie a woolly bugger, you can certainly tie these. You don't have to have the dumbbell eyes in there. The dumbbell eyes don't represent eyes per se on the Hellgrammite. They simply just add some specific weight right at the front to give this much more of a jigging motion in the water. Popular colors for this are the black, as well as a brown and an olive. You could experiment a little bit with this. The one thing about the Murray's Hellgrammite, which is the kind of the calling card, or the one distinction, is the ostrich herl in the tail. It just helps the tail flow better. It's a little bit stiffer in the water as opposed to collapse. But that's the Murray's Hellgrammite. It's a great pattern for smallmouth throughout the season and in the fall. Bouncing this around the bottom, swinging it, all very, very productive. Murray's Hellgrammite.
Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.